really try to encourage our clients to do is, if possible, you should be publicizing all of your charitable contributions. Because if you're making this stuff public, it's less likely, this isn't foolproof, but less likely to have some nefarious purpose, and transparency is always better than not.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Mike DeBernardis, partner at Hughes Hubbard, for our continuing look at key corruption cases over the years. In this exploration, we're going to look at some pharmaceutical cases and see if we can mine those for what it meant at the time, what it means now, and what it may mean in the future. So, Mike, first of all, welcome back.
Thanks, Tom. Happy to be back and looking forward to this discussion about the pharma industry.
So, Mike, we've selected three enforcement actions, to look at. An early one with Eli Lilly, which was an SEC enforcement action, and then two other pharmaceutical actions, Fresenius and Teva Pharmaceuticals. Teva had a pretty large fine of over $500 million. Fresenius came in at $231. Lilly was back at $29 million. But in many ways, I found Lilly the most interesting, and indeed the one that resonates with me the most even until today. This was a 2012 case, and Lilly had 4 separate bribery schemes in 4 different countries. One was sort of a traditional corrupt agent, which we had seen several of by that time, and we continued to see them. But there were 2 others that we really saw for the first time. One was in Brazil, where the sales model of Eli Lilly was a distributor. And they had a distributor program, but they let one distributor through the program who was clearly engaged in bribery and corruption to the point where they were given a distributor discount outside the range of the standard distributor range of their program in that country. If there was ever a question previous to Lilly of whether distributors were covered by the FCPA, this case answered it. But the more interesting one that still resonates with me was a bribery scheme in Poland. And here they focused on Director General of Polish Health Services in one state in Poland, Silesia. This Director General had a legitimate charity ongoing in Poland that renovated castles. And so donations were made to the charity. And the charity had nothing to do with healthcare. And the donations were relatively small, between $3,000 to $7,000. But the SEC in the settlement order put a little cute chart together, or handy chart, I should say, which was date of donation, date of contract signed, or date of payment made. And they literally were within 24 hours of each other. So that was pretty clearly a situation where charitable donations were used to cover bribe payments, even if it was a legitimate charity and there were legitimate payments to a legitimate charity. But there was one other thing that struck me about this case that I think is with us till today and will be with us going forward, which was the following. The payments of to Lilly from the Silesian Health Service took that province or state to the number 1 state in Poland for revenue for Lilly. And it took the country of Poland from number 20 in their Europe, North Africa region, what I would call EMEA, but from 23 to number 3. And that's how significant the profits were. And that became, I think, the basis of modern data analytics. Because if you looked at that from a business perspective, you would say, wow, how did we do so well? Do we have a new product? Do we have a new service? Do we have a sale? Do we have a super salesman? Do we have a great sales team? How can we take that increase in sales and replicate it on a business basis? And that's things businesses do every day. But no one had done that from the compliance perspective. And so I think people started thinking about, if you've got a huge spike in sales, you might need to look at it from the compliance perspective. Now, the other two cases, they had different schemes. Fresenius, unfortunately, and Teva probably, the bribery and corruption were baked into their entire worldwide business model. And that's why their fines and penalties were so much higher. But once again, we had a series of cases from one industry that I think the Department of Justice was able to crack the code in the way they did in the energy space, to look at companies in a much more flexible but robust manner. So I guess what did you see these cases mean from a prosecutorial perspective?
Yeah, you know, with the energy cases that we talked about last time, I mentioned that I thought that prosecutors had unlocked this formula, kind of the hub and spoke model of investigation, where you find the agent or the connecting party, and if they're doing it for one company, maybe they're doing it for others. I think this is a slightly different formula that they sort of unlocked with these pharma cases. And, you know, at least the DOJ insists that they don't do industry sweeps. I think the SEC probably has a little bit more authority to kind of look at an industry overall, but and perhaps does do formal industry sweeps. But what's clear here is that what started probably with Lilly was, you know, we have a pharma company using a particular method. It's improper to win business. Is it possible that other pharma companies are doing the same thing? And you know, once they asked that question and started to ask the right questions and request the right type of information from other pharma companies, the dominoes started falling. And you know, we're talking about 3 here, but the total list is much larger. And when you really look at it and look at the schemes, it's kind of shocking how similar they are. You know, there's some differences, as you mentioned. You know, there's traditional agents, there's the distributor model, there's a set of schemes that involves just direct payments or you know, really high value gifts to doctors to prescribe pharmaceutical products. But it's really remarkable across companies how similar these are. And I actually think, if I'm not mistaken, I think that the charity you mentioned in Poland, I think that was actually that same charity received donations in a different FCPA case a few years prior to Lilly. So to me, that's it. This sort of, I don't want to call it an industry sweep, because I know that from the prosecutorial side, that's not how they look at it. But this idea that, all right, we've got Lilly or we've got Teva, let's ask these same questions to another company doing business in these same markets, and see what we get. And it was really from a prosecutorial perspective, a successful model. You know, the number of pharma cases really is it's pretty high at this point, and it's from using this type of approach.
I misspoke on Fresenius. That's a medical device company, not a pharmaceutical company. But many of these strategies were used, and we saw some different bribery schemes come into the fore, particularly around hospitals and physicians. So, for instance, in some places, hospital administrators were bribed, or payments were made to hospitals, but then the administrator would distribute those to the individual doctors who would prescribe the medications. Sometimes the doctors were bribed directly, but there were other indirect bribes that were very significant in the pharmaceutical and medical healthcare industry, such as conferences. And so sending people to 5-star resorts for 5 days of conferencing with their families certainly became something that went under scrutiny. Paying people for speeches of $5 or $10 or much more $1,000 for either a fake speech or a very short speech also came under scrutiny. And paying doctors for things like scholarly articles that were never published but came under scrutiny. So we had areas of companies that perhaps had not received compliance or FCPA scrutiny also come under some type of scrutiny. You mentioned in Lilly, the predecessor or precursor to Lilly was Sharing Plow. And you're absolutely right. It was the same. It was not only the same charity, it was the same Director General of the Salesian Health Service. And if you have a red flag from a prior SEC, if you have a named individual in charity from a prior SEC enforcement action, I'm not quite sure how much bigger a red flag you could have. So the information was out there. But I worked in the energy space in the first decade of this year or this century, and charitable donations were not scrutinized closely then. We had a charitable foundation that made both domestic and international donations, relatively small, but not given a lot of compliance oversight. So that became something more to the fore, particularly around the healthcare and pharmaceutical industry. We also had, as I mentioned, the hospital administrators. We saw in other cases, particularly in China, where the money would be distributed. And then the last thing these cases, I think, made people realize was outside of the United States, almost all healthcare is nationalized. And that means it's a state-owned enterprise, and that means FCPA implications. And whereas you and I probably wouldn't think of healthcare in that manner, even in England, in every other country in the world, certainly in communist or former communist countries, but even in countries like Mexico, healthcare is nationalized, so that a payment to a doctor is a bribe under the FCPA. And it got people, I think, thinking about the expansion of their view of who is covered under the FCPA. What are your thoughts on any of that, Mike?
Yeah, I was going to mention that point about the nationalized healthcare, because you're absolutely right, and we've seen later on where companies use these same types of models and schemes in the U.S. implicate different laws when you do it in the U.S. than when you do it outside the U.S. But absolutely, I mean, I think it made companies sort of rethink at this time, especially with Lilly. So we're talking about 2012. At this time, this idea that obviously we know ministers and members of royal families, those are government officials. And by this time, SOEs, in terms of, whether they're state-owned oil companies or something like that, that had been sort of driven home. So everybody was, really well aware that those types of individuals would be considered government officials. And it started with Lilly and then continuing on through this string of whether it was pharma or medical device cases, this idea that all of the players in the medical industry outside of the U.S. are probably officials, all the way down from nurses and doctors at the hospitals, all the way up to, health ministers. And so it was a sort of a clear example of that. And I think that lesson probably expanded beyond the healthcare industry to lead a lot of clients to rethink about the parties they were interacting with and whether they might be government officials. Maybe they worked at a state university or something similar to that in a foreign country. One of the other things I think struck me about this series of cases, because you touched on it, they were doing speaking tours, they were paying for articles, all of these things. All of those, if done correctly, had a valid business justification, because these were, for the most part, experts in the field. And so people that they would have wanted to hire to come to a conference, to speak at a conference, or they would have wanted to write an article about a particular medical device. It is, it's not black and white. So done appropriately, done right, it would probably be fine. But virtually across the board, these companies just took it too far. Either they went to speak at a conference and were paid an exorbitant fee and spoke for 20 minutes and then, had a 7-day vacation, or they were hired to write an article and never wrote it, which takes, what would have been a valid business expense and turns it into a violation. You could almost say the same for the charitable contribution. I think that was chosen as a violation for a reason, right? It was the timing of the payments was really clear. There were emails showing that the intent of the payments were to curry favor with this official. In a different circumstance, those same exact payments probably aren't going to be touched by a prosecutor because, as you mentioned, this was a legitimate charity. The money went to the charity. It wasn't used as a pass through, as far as we know, and they're relatively modest amounts. But it's everything around the payments that show the true intent of what they were used for. Under different circumstances, they probably would have been fine.
So, Mike, I guess I wanted to ask you also if you get a call from a client, they've either received an inquiry, a subpoena, or they've just found something. How do you help them think through this really holistic approach? And if we can just stick with charitable donations, have you done due diligence on the charity? Who are the owners of the charity? Is the charity distributing the funds that are given it? And then how is the charity connected either to the government official, or is there even an indirect benefit to the government official? How do you help them think through that more holistic approach?
Yeah, hopefully we get the call on the front end asking us to help them put in place a process for their charitable donations. And that's, you've touched on the right things, right? It's diligence on the recipient. So what is this organization? Is it a real charity? Now, in this case, that would have shown up. Yes, this is a legitimate charity. What are the connections to any government officials, if any? How was this charity chosen? So there's got to be some internal look at why are we picking this one, right? Whose idea was it? Where did it come from? How does this support our broader mission as a company? And then, very similar to third-party due diligence, we always recommend that companies are following up to make sure the money went where they thought it was going to go. So, I want to donate to this fund to help build a hospital. Let's make sure that the money actually went to build that hospital. Let's follow up afterwards. If you can donate in kind, that's always better than donating cash, right? So all of those, the process is different than third-party due diligence you might do on an agent, but the hallmarks are very similar in terms of what the companies should be looking for and how they should be following up. And then the final thing we really try to encourage our clients to do is, if possible, you should be publicizing all of your charitable contributions, because if you're making this stuff public, it's less likely, this isn't foolproof, but less likely to have some nefarious purpose, and transparency is always better than not.
That's a key point that I talked about early on in my FCPA commentary days, but it's equally true today, which is sunlight is the best disinfectant and transparency is always critical. That was usually thought of around gifts and entertainment. Can you give this gift in front of the supervisor's employees? Can they find out you took them to dinner? But equally important is the transparency around charitable donations, because as you said, if you can't publicly disclose it, there's probably a pretty good reason. Either the donation shouldn't have been made, couldn't have been made, or was made with an illegal intent. So transparency is still a big part of compliance programs, and this was really some of the first times, particularly in the charitable donation space, that I think transparency came to the fore.
Yeah, I think that's right. It also, for better or worse for Lilly, but for better for the industry overall, up until this point, it wasn't always easy to convince a client that they needed to put strict controls around charitable contributions. Is that really going to be considered a violation of the FCPA? Is this a high risk area? This was sort of a poster child for it. Here you go. This is exactly what can go wrong to contributions to a legitimate charity that are used for the purpose that they were intended. This isn't a situation where we had somebody set up a sham foundation to funnel money to an official. This was a legitimate charity where, as far as we can tell, the money that was donated went to restoring the castle or the castles. I think it was supposed to be for several renovations, but So this was a nice example to be able to use to convince clients to take this seriously.
Now let me turn to Lilly and their distributor model in Brazil, because there were a lot of lessons at the time that I think we're still utilizing today. The process Lilly had, and they had a written process, be documented, which was the following. There was a rigorous due diligence process around the distributor. Then the information, after it was vetted by compliance, went to a distributor approval committee. That committee made a recommendation, and it was approved at a next level up of senior management. The key was there was a range of discounts given to each distributor between 6 and 12%. The distributor in question with Lilly was given a 17% discount with no business justification for that exception or a different discount. And of course, that extra 5% funded the bribe to pay to doctors. And this was, I think, very instructive at the time, because I'm not sure people had thought through what is a distributorship approval process look like, and we had one. But equally importantly, you can make exceptions. You can override an internal control, but you have to document that with a business reason. And that's something I think we use today. So I was wondering how valid or not valid do you see that as an example of something that's really stood the test of time?
Oh, absolutely. This is just a perfect example of the two things you just mentioned, right? One, hey, we've done all this focus on agents. We recognize that excessive commissions can be used for bribe payments. That is well understood across industries. What should we be doing with distributors? They seem like they're lower risk. How can they be used improperly? And this is exactly it. And this showed it, and we've seen this sort of basic model used over and over and over again. But also to the business justification point, I think so many problems in the third-party due diligence process can be addressed by really focusing on the business justification. Put the business people to it. Make them justify this, not with just some, we don't have resources or it's a really qualified third party, whatever. Put them to it, make them provide a real explanation for why we need a distributor, why they need to be paid what kind of discount they're getting, and why it should be this particular one. Because if you do that, if you make them really work for it, you can start to see sort of gaps in the story and start to identify issues. And here, this is a lot of these. This is an extreme example where you have this significantly larger discount with no explanation provided really whatsoever. And it makes you wonder, if they had asked the follow-up questions, what kind of response they would have gotten and whether this could have been sort of cut off at the pass.
Well, Mike, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I think we concluded that the Lilly case particularly not only stands the test of time, but we're still using many of the concepts put forward today. And Teva and Fresenius also presented some interesting aspects where we learned about different ways or different funding schemes for pots of money to create bribes. I hope our listeners will join us for our next episode where we take a look at some tech cases.